Miniature Landscape Hobbies is proudly supported by these sponsors.
Hi, Joe from Miniature Landscape Hobbies here with my niece Ava. We're getting ready to do something that basically all grade 10 students in Canadian high school do. Grade 10, right?
Yes.
Yeah. We're going to build a diorama of a World War I trench line. Now, Canadians are particularly proud of their World War I heritage, and we like to immortalize it by, well, building a trench. So, Ava, have you ever built a trench before?
No.
No? And do you know how to build a trench?
No.
Well, you've come to the right spot. What do we know about trenches so far?
There's a lot of sandbags.
A lot of sandbags, and we've 3D printed some. And what else do you know? Do you know what a duckboard is?
No.
She's about to find out. Now, Ava, you are a lucky person because most people that do this project don't have an uncle that's a professional miniature builder. So what do you think this project is going to look like when it's done?
Hopefully a trench.
I was going to say maybe an A+, but we'll work with that. Okay. In this project, we're going to go step by step on how you can build a similar trench for yourself. Now, we're going to use some techniques and use some tools that you might not have at home, but you should be able to substitute other things you have around the house. Most importantly, we're going to use some really basic stuff, like sand and balsa wood. If you have some insulation foam and some MDF too, that would also be handy. Okay, with that being said, let's get down to it.
Like always, the first step is to plan the work. Most of the work is going to be based on the diorama maker's favorite medium, 1-inch insulation foam. The stuff we have here is dark gray, but this comes in other colors, and the color really doesn't make much of a difference. This stuff is cheap, comes from any hardware store, and can be cut and sculpted, making it a perfect and essential product for these types of jobs. After we get our foam out, Ava just goes ahead and draws her trench details onto the surface of it. Okay, so here we are. We've now mapped out our trench. It's about 4 centimeters wide with a 2 centimeter wide firing step. 4 centimeters because our duck boards are going to be cut about 3 centimeters wide. And we've put a communications trench in, a dugout. And why isn't our trench straight, Ava?
Because then they can shoot down the trench line.
Right, so what else are we missing?
Oh, craters.
Do you want to draw some craters in for us? And yes, being a war zone, we need some craters, so Ava draws these in too. With the details drawn in, Ava uses a hot wire foam cutter and begins cutting out the trench line and dugout. And Ava cuts and cuts. I'm showing a tabletop model of foam cutter here, but you can do this with a long-bladed box cutter, although you'll have to change the blades frequently. In all honesty, though, a wire cutter is pretty important and not terribly expensive. I'll put a link to one from my sponsor, Torchlight Games, in the video description if you want to buy one for yourself. Torchlight Games also has most of the paints and supplies I show in the video available. As a package deal, subscribe to my Patreon and save 5% on your supplies from them. This is a win-win for the avid diorama builder. Kasprong! Okay, so now it's time to do the craters, and what we could do is use a knife and cut these out like a chump, but we're smarter than that. We're going to use a heat gun. Now, make sure you do this in an area that's well ventilated. We're in a reasonably well ventilated area, and all you need to do is turn it on and run it over the space around your crater. How long you focus the heat gun on the crater will determine how deep the crater is.
One eternity later.
With the craters added, Ava gets out a 2-foot by 2-foot square piece of 3mm MDF and paints the underside of the foam with a thick coat of Mod Podge. We use Mod Podge here, but white glue or wood glue would work just as well. Flipping the parts over, she now assembles them on the MDF like a giant jigsaw puzzle. Okay, with the pieces set and glued down, we just grabbed some heavy books and weighed it all down. And yes, it's best to use books. Since it's a military history diorama, it's best to use military history books. Now is as good a time as any for Ava to build the retaining walls in the trench. So she measures out strips of 2mm balsa plywood that are as wide as the back wall of the trench, the depth of the fire step, and the height between the top of the fire step and the trench. Then with a craft knife, she cuts these all out. She needs enough for the whole length of the interior of the trench itself, so it takes quite a bit of time. As this went on, we also prepared the duckboards to go down the length of the bottom of the trench. At this point I have to make a confession. We only had 2 days for the build, so I didn't have Ava cut these all out by hand. And no, I didn't cut them either. Instead, I fired up my laser cutter. Ava's not a chump. She just went and used a laser cutter. And she laser cut the duckboards. The duckboards were now super glued to some wood runners, while I fired up the airbrush and sprayed all of the wood black and very dark brown. You could of course paint these by hand, or use a spray paint rattle can as well. When this was done, Ava also went ahead and painted the bottom of the trench dark brown. And while we're on the topic of paint, I grabbed a bottle of Dectan model paint, and Ava dry brushed this over the wood. Dry brushing is the process where you load a brush with paint, wipe most of it off, and then flick it back and forth across the subject quickly to only deposit pigment at the edges and on raised areas. Now while all this was drying, Ava went back to the craters and built up the rims. She did this by hot gluing chunks of foam around them. Then she blasted these with a heat gun to make the transitions between the pieces rounded, and then finally she wrapped her work in masking tape. You could use plaster or air drying clay to achieve this effect too, but the masking tape method is faster, and when it's treated with Mod Podge, it turns rock hard. All of the retaining wall sections can now be superglued in place. To make it easier, Ava uses a superglue accelerant spray. Okay, spray. Don't worry if it's a little gappy here and there, we can fix it, yeah. Plus it's war. At this point, we're nearing the end of our first day's work, but we have one more major step, texturing the foam. To do this, Ava mixes equal parts Mod Podge and dark brown acrylic paint in one container, and in another, she mixes sandbox sand and kitty litter. And yes, I mean clean kitty litter. Then she paints down a layer of the glue paint mixture, and we sprinkle it all with the grit. She proceeds in patches until all the exposed earth is covered on the board. To assist with the setting of the grit and to make the work rock solid, I now help Ava mix a combo of 10% of the existing Mod Podge dark brown paint mixture with 70% water and 20% rubbing alcohol. Then we load this into a squeeze bottle and we apply it all over the grit. The rubbing alcohol helps reduce the surface tension of the mix, helping it flow into the grit so everything can be adhered firmly. This will need some time to dry, so we call it quits for day 1.
Day 2.
The next day, the grit is dry, so Ava and I begin dry brushing the surface. She uses several shades of brown and tan, working darkest to lightest over all of the earth-covered areas. After this, she superglues various matchsticks down in rows on the no man's land side of the trench, and then she cut them to a variety of lengths. Later on, these will form the uprights for holding her barbed wire in place. To apply water collecting in the shell craters, Ava poured some UV curing gloss resin into the deepest areas, and then she set it in place by shining a UV flashlight on it. We did this because of time limitations, and UV resin can be cured almost instantly, but you can achieve this effect by pouring gloss Mod Podge into the craters as well. Just be prepared to give it a couple of days to dry. Turning her attention back to the wooden stakes, Ava superglues a coiled length of picture wire we bought at the hardware store to these. Over the years, I've found picture wire makes convincing barbed wire, and most importantly, it's cheap. She then follows up by painting the stakes brown and the wire in rust colors. While all this painting was going on, I helped out by mixing Mod Podge, green and brown paints, water, and rubbing alcohol into a mix. Then we used a pipette to deposit this around the duckboards to imply that water was accumulating in the bottom of the trench.
And no, it doesn't stay a pleasant minty green, I hope.
Well, that'd be kind of concerning if it did.
Things were now pretty well in hand, but it was looking all just very drab and brown. To add some color, Ava painted Mod Podge down in patches on the grit, and using a static grass applicator, sprinkled various colors down over top. She then followed up by gluing down a variety of grass tufts and some balsa wood cut-offs. She painted these to match the surroundings in various brown shades.
More brown and more wood.
Please remember that though we use some very specific model building products here like static grass and grass tufts, you can also use other things that you find around the house or in your garden to imply the naturalized details. Finally, to cap things off, Ava went ahead and gave the greenery a couple of spritzes of hairspray to hold it all in place. This gives it some resiliency and makes sure that her details won't be destroyed by handling. And with this, the whole project was finally done. Now Ava has a well-made and very detailed World War I trench diorama to present to her high school history class. I admit that it was a lot of hard work for her, but I think the results speak for themselves. So in the end, I hear you say, is this work worthy of an A though? I guess we'll just have to wait and see. What do you think, Ava? Miniature Landscape Hobbies will be back next week with more miniature building and wargaming content. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Check out the links to my awesome sponsors, and if you can, consider joining my Patreon. Thanks for watching, see you next time, and until then, please remember to keep building life in miniature.